be the next speaker, so I'm going to introduce myself. I can take.
Oh yeah, of course.
Let's go with this one actually. Okay, so my name is Andres Perez. I'm a professor of epidemiology here at the College of Veterinary Medicine, University of Minnesota. The purpose of this presentation is to share some of the work we have been doing and some of the ideas we have been entertaining related with enhancing our capacity for passive surveillance for hemorrhagic fevers. The background information here is that we have noticed that much work has been done, much progress has been made over the decades to reduce the time between first suspect of an emergency and confirmation of that emergency. And we are now in a point where we are reasonably certain that once we suspect that we have a foreign animal disease, it's going to take only a few hours until we can confirm whether that's a true case of a foreign animal disease or not. But still, there is much work to do to try to reduce as much as possible the time between first suspect of an emergency, introduction of the virus or foreign animal disease, and first suspect of that introduction. So that's quite uncertain, and this is a busy slide, but basically what's showing is a number of examples for classical swine fever and African swine fever, in which the time between first introduction of the virus into a free country and first suspect typically will take anything between 3, 4, 5 weeks and a couple of months, with the most recent example in Hispaniola, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, in which actually that time frame is quite uncertain. We don't know how long it took. So we think that, and following the presentation that Dr. Vanicek made earlier, there is an opportunity to try to work in decreasing as much as possible that time between first introduction of a foreign animal disease and first suspect of that introduction. So the concepts that we have been working with have been defined by some as enhanced passive surveillance, which basically refers to those activities that are performed by the private sector targeting certain events that are considered high risk. And the other concept that we use here has been referred as participatory surveillance, in which we try to use a scoring system and surveys to get certain data that then are used to try to calibrate that perception of risk. And then using that perception of risk, try to target the surveillance event to those situations in which the risk is perceived to be higher. So the objective here was to develop an enhanced passive surveillance protocol for African swine fever to support early detection of suspects in pig farms. The intention of this approach is to use pre-outbreak, so before we actually have a confirmation of a disease, and with the objective of trying to anticipate as much as possible the detection of an outbreak. And we think, based on certain work that has been done, that we could potentially reduce the time between introduction and first suspect in a few weeks. And that will not really eliminate the problem in the affected farms, but will mitigate the impact, the secondary impact of the incursion into other farms. And that could be helpful in countries that are free from the disease, but also in countries that are affected by the disease, because then we can use this approach to mitigate the impact of introduction into areas or group of farms that were believed to be free. So the way we built this approach was considering three levels of data that are collected from the farms. The first one is an evaluation of the biosecurity features of the farm or group of farms. And in that sense, it's somehow related with RABAP, with some of the work that Gustavo has been showing and doing. And that represents an initial background information, cross-sectional information of what may be a priori the expected risk of that farm. That's done at the beginning of the study and renewed on a regular basis. And then the second component syndromic surveillance that relates with the clinical events that are perceived and identified in the farm. These data are collected on a routine basis. In the examples in which we have been working, we have been doing this weekly. So that data collection actually, depending on the events of syndromic surveillance that are perceived in the farm, we incorporate that into the score, and that will make a modification of the score on a weekly basis. And the third component is coming from necropsy findings and samples that are collected on the farm. That third component may be related with a component that Dr. Vanicek described initially today with the sick pig program, where we incorporate the data that are associated with findings coming from those sick pigs. So with these three components, we build a score, and that score is renewed on a weekly basis, and we use that information to inform our active surveillance activities. So this has been implemented through a questionnaire that we have been testing in endemic locations in the Dominican Republic and in Russia. For known reasons, we had to discontinue work in Russia, so I will show in the results that we obtained in the DR, but they are quite similar to what we were seeing in Russia. Information has been gathered using a relatively simple survey that is administered by the farms on a weekly basis. We score the answers using a grades or weights that were provided by 3 African swine fever reference laboratories based on the experience that they had with the disease. And then the fluctuations of the scores are used to identify triggers for testing. So when certain conditions are met, when certain scores are reached, then there is a recommendation for testing in the farm before we actually see strong evidence of presence of the disease. And we have been working on with the idea of eventually trying to automatize this process as much as possible. So then it's run through the IT systems that the farms have and running algorithms for detection behind the scenes of that increase in risk. So some preliminary results in the DR. We have been working in 2 farms that are typical for production systems in the DR. This farm A, and this is they have some issues in the drainage, and that's the reason why you see pictures there. They also do their own slaughtering in the farm, so you may see that that's another factor that has been increasing the risk in the DR. Farm 2 was smaller and has worse conditions. So these are the results of the scoring system that we have been collecting. One of the interesting things that we found here, this is farm B, so this is smaller, and this farm A. So if we were to run a cross-sectional analysis, if we were to look at the picture of the status of the farms, our assumption would be that farm B here will have a higher risk. So the higher the score, the higher the risk. So this farm will have a higher risk of introduction of African swine fever if we were to look at the cross-sectional study. But then when we continued this evaluation over an extended period of time, so here we have 20 weeks of data, we can see that really there is not much going on in farm B. So from a health perspective, this farm is not as good as farm A, but it remains like that throughout. So there is no really evidence that there is much going on there. However, it's interesting to see that whereas farm A a priori may have a lower risk in terms of introduction, when we run the system and we evaluate the evolution of the system in time, longitudinally, we see that there is a lot going on here. And that variation, this fluctuation, is what we think could be an interesting indication of an introduction of an hemorrhagic fever into a farm. I'll get into that in a minute. But then when this, what we show here is that we can run behind the scenes algorithms for detection of anomalies. So we can incorporate the scores into a system. We don't really need to see the data, so that will eliminate some of the concerns that they may have, the producers may have in terms of confidentiality, because we don't get access to the data themselves. We incorporate that into the IT system, and then we run the algorithms behind the scene to identify the times in which there was an increase in the risk. So here, this is farm B, where we see that the risk was stable, and really we didn't have any evidence here of a cluster that will suggest the need for incorporating a test, because the score is calibrated by the values that were perceived previously in time. So we didn't see any variation there that will suggest the need for testing. However, when we get into farm A, what we see is that there was a significant increase towards the end of the period that may suggest that there may be a need there for actively testing that farm. And that's the type of signals that we would like to detect, and the way in which we think this process could be automatized using routinely collected data to support the decision of prompting some active surveillance. So when we get into that farm, farm A, here we see the difference in the data that we are collecting. So what we perceive or what we expect is that moving forward, when we calibrate the system and we can use it routinely, we don't have a need to see the data, as I mentioned before. But when we get back and look at the data for these ones that we had access and try to make an interpretation out of that, so this is farm B. We can see that really there was not much going on. There were signs of disease, but they were quite constant, and mostly based on the necropsies that we did there were associated with pneumonia. So yeah, there was a higher risk score there, but really there was no evidence of anything strange going on. Now, when we get into farm A, you can see that what was interesting was that there was an accumulation of signs that may be associated with hemorrhagic fever, but those signs didn't happen at the same time. And we think that that may be the reason why sometimes we may be missing those cases, because you never get that definition of a case at one single point in time. But if you were to evaluate those signs that have been accumulated over an extended period of time, you basically will get what would be considered a typical sign of presence of hemorrhagic fever. So what we think is that by these longitudinal systems that can help collect and organize the data in a systematic way, we may be able to identify that early evidence that actually there was an introduction of the virus. So in conclusion, what we think is that this protocol may help producers that are free in infected areas to be aware of possible incursions of ASF, or in free areas like the US may help to systematize the way data are collected and are perceived and are understood to then facilitate certain actions. So when we ask people in the DR, what are you doing to try to early detect the presence of the disease, what they say is that we keep looking, right? So we keep looking, but what are you looking at? And this is where we think that systematizing the process can help to facilitate an early detection of an introduction. So it also allows for a dynamic evaluation of the risk factors in the farms weekly, allowing to take certain decisions on a weekly basis. And with the right lab support, the farm can also identify the disease in the herd, anticipating, we think, time to detection by mortalities, particularly with what we are seeing with attenuated strains, that basically the evidence of the signs are not as clear as we would have expected with a more classical strain. So with that, I want to thank APHIS for the support and our collaborators at the Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo who have been working with us through the collection of the data. So thank you. I understand that I'm the only thing that they interfere between yourself and coffee. So if there are no questions, then.
You had the kind of the data chart showed the scoring,
yes.
And it just said scoring, and I was wondering if you could just kind of elaborate on that, because you said there's a very systematic approach, but how do you come up with whether the numbers and the data? And I apologize if I missed that.
No, you didn't miss that. You're right. I didn't elaborate on that. Thank you. So we have these three components: the evaluation of biosecurity in the farm, syndromic surveillance or clinical signs in the farm, and the third one will be the findings of necropsy. So we made a list of different factors that, based on the information that we got from the three reference laboratories and from the field, would be the factors that may increase the risk of having an hemorrhagic fever outbreak. So we work with African swine fever primarily, but also up to some extent with classical swine fever. So we made that list of factors, and then what we do is that we ask the farmers to evaluate every week if they have seen those factors or not. And then we have a weight, there's a numeric score that has been provided by the reference laboratories, which is what we do, what we use to convert those visualizations, qualitative data into quantities.
Very good, thank you. Just a follow-up question. You mentioned that there's a biosecurity component. Is that like is that also evaluated or checked weekly or changes, or is that a permanent component of that score?
A good question. We initially we started with the idea that was, yeah. So the question is if the first component, the component related with biosecurity, we repeat that evaluation on a routine basis, or it's just done only once. So we started with the idea we'll do it only once, and actually one of the feedback that we got after this pilot is that we should repeat that with a certain frequency. The recommendation in the DR was to repeat that every 3 months, which is really what they think may represent a significant change on certain protocols. So now what we are hoping that we'll be able to do is to evaluate this protocol in a larger number of farms in northeastern DR. And they actually will be collecting the data, organizing themselves in terms of how they're going to share the data among themselves. So in a sense, it will become some sort of a pilot for a regional project for surveillance. Yeah.
Maybe I've missed it, Andres. Why are they not using diagnostics as a component of this model and just using surveys?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. The idea is that the detection of the anomalies, so we are evaluating the scores, right? And we are collecting these scores on a weekly basis. And then what we do is that we focus in identifying anomalies. So when the score has gone above what would be expected, given what we are seeing in a given room or farm. So then when there is a significant increase over the value of the score, that's where we will prompt the testing. And that's where we think that for now what we are doing is just submitting samples to the lab, but that's where we think that other alternatives may help because they may run on farm. So basically they may be able to follow up the detection of certain evidence of presence of the disease with a test that may give them some initial indication of whether that's the case or not.
So how do you establish or how do you recommend to set up the threshold for because for the syndromic surveillance to work, you need to kind of know the threshold. And like for the necropsy findings, is there like a minimum sample size where you recommend this the minimum amount of pigs that you need to evaluate on a weekly basis? Because especially for African swine fever, where it could take 2 to 3 weeks to actually see an increase, perhaps when they see it, it's already for 3 weeks.
Yeah, so first question was?
It's kind of one overall, how do you establish how do you recommend the threshold? How do you know, how do you set up the threshold for each farm?
So the threshold is given by the farm itself. So it's based on the value that you get on that given farm or room over an extended period of time. So you get a certain indication of what's the expected value that you get in that farm or that room. And that depends on the diseases that farm will have. So then what we do is that we monitor how that score fluctuates and whether there is a significant increase from that base threshold that is established in that farm. Does it make sense? So it's not a raw number. It's not a number that will be applicable to everyone because that farm is different, basically.
Right, so how do you tell that to each farm? Because since it's not the same recommendation for everybody, how do you tell this is going to be?
You need to start collecting data when you know that you're free. So you establish that threshold in that farm, and you know that would be the expected value in that farm in the absence of any other new introduction.
Okay, thanks.
And the second was the number of necropsies. Yeah, so what we have seen with attenuated strains is that really there is a time between the introduction and the mortalities. And depending on the farms that we have seen, it takes a few weeks, but not for the early signs. So you see the early signs. What you don't see is the accumulation of signs in one single period of time. So in terms of recommending necropsies is any sick pig. We don't have specific recommendations. Questions? Coffee time? Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to break for a few minutes. I think that we actually have half an hour, and then we're getting back. Thank you.